the burden of that shouldn't be on the person sitting down to enter that content. Sometimes it's actually the engineers who are sort of like, we have our way of doing things, we're going to just push forward as we want to. And then that comes back to making sure that, both sides are kind of coming to the table. And it was also one of those things where the whole reason that they had come to Sanity in the first place was for this exact moment. It becomes this very like malleable or like plastic thing that you can kind of just like interact with, like a semantic dimension of content. And
hello, Internet. Welcome back to the Code and Content Podcast, the podcast for conversations at the intersection of code and content. Joining me today on this episode is Noah, who's one of our great solution architects here at Sanity and has worked with some of the largest developer teams we've seen on the platform. Hundreds of authors working on content simultaneously, and those have unique challenges that you might be less familiar with if you're a developer who has a single blog or have only worked with small teams before. The needs for massive authoring teams are a little bit different and require a close relationship and a close bit of communication between engineering teams and authoring teams to get the right result, especially when pressing publish might mean selling a few million or a few tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars worth of product as soon as that document goes live. So Noah has really seen these things at the edge. Unfortunately, if you are watching the video version of this podcast, I'm not a very good video producer, turns out. The entire episode is out of focus, and I'm so sorry. I had about 3 seconds of Noah in focus that I got to use for the thumbnail, which I'm happy for, and then the whole thing is completely blurry. So I'll put something on the screen if you prefer the video version. Otherwise, if you're just listening to us in audio, enjoy the episode.
great.
Noah, welcome to the Code and Content Podcast.
Thanks for having me. Welcome to San Francisco.
Oh, thank you. You're the first person who's welcomed me here. I think that's good.
It's been nice to have you in the office.
Great. Okay. That's nice. I've been half asleep the whole time, and the LaCroix consumption is going through the roof.
Yeah.
But you've just introduced me to a new ginger ale. What's the
Zevia ginger ale?
Zevia ginger ale. I'm all over that. There's going to be a few more of those sunk before I'm done here. So
this isn't sponsored by Zevia though.
Not yet. I would wear something Zevia sponsored if they can make that happen. So I wanted to bring you in on the podcast because it's been the theme of these recordings, speaking about the importance that developers really need to focus on the needs of content authors. It's not just set and forget, write markdown, all of that sort of thing. So you have been at the forefront as a solution engineer here at Sanity of some of our biggest customers, and we're talking like hundreds of authors across multiple teams.
Oh, yes.
That when they press publish on something, this might need to sell $100 million on a Black Friday deal or something. And so that's critical content. With that setting, are there any sort of first thoughts that come to mind about what you've seen or you've experienced in that sort of world?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things where it's also important to remember how the CMS itself, like the content management interface, is only one slice of this huge operation of like content, the planning of what is going to go out, who is going to be involved in that, scoping out, what it's going to take to actually push this out into the world, prioritizing it. It's like there's this whole kind of end-to-end process that has to happen around content. And it's not until someone sits down, into either Sandy Studio or some other content management system where they're entering that content, publishing that content, and distributing it. And then, that's getting broadcast, around the world. But there's this whole other overlaid process on top of that. And
I'll help you out here. Marketing, we're coining a term, or we're at least talking about content lifecycle.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A very wide breadth of activities that happen during the content.
Yeah, that's right. Because I think content starts somewhere. It's not always in the CMS. It's in a Google Doc or like an Apple Notes page or something. And eventually it gets modified and worked on and reviewed and audited and then makes its way into the CMS. And from that point, you press publish. Like you say, that might need to rebuild the site, revalidate a cache, set off a webhook, send off an email. And just the content in the CMS is just a thin vertical slice of that journey. That's right. And I think that's probably what we underestimate. A lot of developers like myself, I've got a CMS for my blog on one person, and that's content management sort of distills down to that, or maybe a small business, maybe one or two authors. But there's unique challenges when it comes to those mega teams that have compliance and all sorts of things.
Yeah. And I think in my own journey, kind of working with content applications and kind of working with these teams, working and creating content. I'm a developer by profession. I'm a solution architect at Sanity now, but I came from an agency background building these types of applications, and so I definitely towards the start of my career was sort of just working on, like blogs and kind of, much more straightforward, like content management for the web. And at this agency, it was sort of a specialized agency that was really focused on creating content for kind of medical, the medical field, doctors and clinicians. And so there's a lot of like very specialized, people working on this, like PhDs and medical doctors who had to produce this content that was then given to us as sort of the design engineering teams to kind of like turn this into, a digital repository for this content. So like there was a lot of challenges there. Like you have, it has to be compliant. There's a lot of like, legal review that has to happen. There's a whole, even just the writing process and production of those assets that then get put into the system. But it just made me realize that like content is so much more than just, the title of your blog post on your page. Like it can be this like very expansive view of things that you're trying to distribute out into the world. It could be, your message into the marketplace as, for your marketing site, but it could be this very specialized knowledge base and content repository as well.
Yeah. I think that's sort of that next level. The majority of people come to us because we're headless CMS and we do a great job of that. But I think where we see the greatest opportunity being capitalized on is when people see value in their content, but the value in their business is what their business knows and can write down. And that's the content behind that business. For sure. And even just in a very small example, I know I've had people have great reactions to just like custom validation rules on fields because they're like, oh wow, I can make sure that string of text in that field is only ever correct in this particular instance. So yeah, validation and compliance, again, on a team of 1 to 2, maybe not a big deal, but to make sure that no matter who of the 100 people that use this CMS will make sure they only ever author correct content. That's table stakes.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remove some of those, it's sort of like mental blocks or barriers, or just like making people, not have to really think about them. Like that the burden of that shouldn't be on the person sitting down to enter that content. Like, as the developers and the engineers creating this editorial interface, for this team to use, like even something as small as, is there a validation to tell me I need to put this thing in, or is it in the right format, or is there?
And will the validation rule tell me what it needs?
What I need to do, what I need to fix, to actually push it
that
through.
It's invalid.
Otherwise, I'm just going to say like, hey, this doesn't work. Get the engineering team, put in a ticket to the engineering team and come fix it.
Yeah.
And then it just creates a lot more bottlenecks in that way too.
Custom error messages and validation rules.
Important stuff.
It's so important. We're covering the big, sexy topics in this podcast, like custom validation rule error messages. But that is important to editors, and it makes me think, as engineers, I've got an engineering background, among other things as well. And we love developer experience. We love tools that do that help for us. But yeah, we're essentially, when you are configuring Sanity applications, you are essentially creating the user experience for the user, right? So yeah, all the things you like about DX, like helpful error messages, you can then put that into the user experience of the studio.
Yeah. Giving them, it's not just the guardrails, but it's just like, greasing the track to like make sure that, someone who's sitting down to do this task, like it's not going to be, burdensome or feel like they're going to have a lot of mental overload to just update, whatever it is that they need to do.
Yeah. And out of the box, Sanity Studio is ungreased tracks without guardrails, which, has its appeal at first, but it's important too. You only really get to that like all singing, all dancing Sanity Studio when you involve yourself with the editors and find out what they need, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really important to have, that collaboration is so important. Sure, it's the engineers that are actually implementing the tool, but like they're not solely responsible for the final product. Like even the eventual content people have to be really involved in that all along the way. It's definitely important later on to make sure that those teams are enabled as well. There's proper, documentation, even if it's inline documentation, like proper descriptions, in your studio, and just helping someone, really, really think about how to move through the system, intuitively. But yeah, making sure that those kind of needs are being catered to. And, as developers, we're all pretty guilty of maybe over-engineering things at times, making things, kind of maybe feels a little bit more over-engineered than it needs to be.
Something that's technically interesting, but not necessarily useful.
Yeah. And so like really trying to step back and make sure that those folks are catered for and that their needs are being met. And that's really what this is all about at the end of the day, is making sure that they're happy and efficient and productive and doing what they need to do.
I think some of the course materials and workshops we've done in the past as well sort of stress having those conversations even before you start writing code.
Absolutely.
Because again, that's also the inclination of a developer is to just, I'll just enter a studio and just rapidly code. And with AI, perhaps it's great. You can now spike ideas faster than ever, but perhaps that also leads you to race to a wrong conclusion faster than ever before.
Yeah.
Where it's good to have that conversation nice and early so you can plan things together before you've committed too much code.
Absolutely. And that's what, my team is really involved with, is kind of facilitating those discussions as well, making sure that everyone's in the room, for those types of sessions, and doing a lot of, sometimes it's hand holding, but it's like, it's really important that people do that. And a lot of times these teams aren't really used to doing that. Like there's a lot of, the technical requirements are being, put through, Jira or ticket tracking system, and, a dev is just being handed that ticket. And so you kind of lose the humanity behind that. Like there's actually someone on the other side of that ticket, that there's going to be use for them in that.
I know I've been surprised by that at least once before. I mean, I haven't worked on one of these massive teams, but I've consulted for a few here. And we had a workshop once, and the authors were on one side of the table, the engineers on the other. And I said, well, how often do you have these meetings? And they were only having that meeting because we were there. They'd never done that before. So super important to get those people together. Because it unlocks that animosity. I think you might see that. I've seen that plenty. It's like authors don't want to talk to engineers, and engineers don't want to talk to authors, but there's that they've got that bad experience of tension between them.
Sometimes they don't understand each other too.
Exactly. It's sort of talking past each other by accident. Yeah.
And I think, it also is true at times that the content or product folks really do understand, the sort of content operating system vision and just what this all should look like at the end of it. And then sometimes it's actually the engineers who are sort of like, we have our way of doing things, we're gonna just push forward as we want to. And then that comes back to making sure that, both sides are kind of coming to the table and trying to hash it out a little bit.
Yeah. I always figured that the role of solution engineer, which I used to do, was part engineer, part therapist, part marriage counselor sort of thing. It's like you're actually bringing people together and working out those personal issues. But yeah, it's super important to do. And so can you give me an example of some like real critical pressing publish times that you've seen? Because like we talked about the content lifecycle, but the truism is that when Black Friday happens, when those posts need to be scheduled to publish, pressing publish on that time more than ever before. So I'm guessing you've seen some pretty high stakes publish press actions.
Yeah, and there is one that comes to mind, a large gaming publisher, and a very important rollout of content for one of their brands and games. And so it was like absolutely crucial that everything was staged beforehand. There was a lot of eyes on this launch. It was very important, not just for them as a company and their brand, but also their players and people who kind of follow what they're putting out into the world. So very, very tense, maybe a couple of weeks leading up to that launch of like, what's going to happen? Will this rollout be smooth? What's going to happen in the studio and in the system when someone publishes content and this kind of whole process takes off to like, do all those things. Like you said, it's going to publish it. It's going to invalidate our caches. It's going to show up, on our sites that people are, refreshing their pages to see the latest content. And so, And it was also one of those things where the whole reason that they had, come to Sanity in the first place was for this exact moment. So it was sort of this like really important culmination of not just all the work that they had put into, building the setup and making sure this was going to all work exactly how they wanted it to, but like it was this really important culmination of like a huge migration had just happened, from their previous system. And so now this was like this first big campaign post-migration. And so it was going to touch pretty much every single channel. Like this is a multi-channel brand, there's a lot of different things that need to go right, and everything went off without a hitch. It was like a huge success, huge success both from this content landed with its audience well, people were excited about it, it drummed up a lot of interest, but also huge success from this engineering and content team that they were able to just like, use the system as it was intended, and, all the fingers crossed and nail biting that had to happen beforehand was, everything was okay in the end.
Excellent. And that was a really long process, wasn't it, to set up all those pieces before that moment?
It was a big process, but in the end, the actual like changes that needed to be made were a lot more simple than they were expecting, because everything had, like, the structured content approach had been in place. They knew all the different types of components that they needed to update, and things were much more consolidated into, they didn't have to go to all of those different websites to update the same thing over and over again. They had, like, the single source of truth in place, made those changes, scheduled them, published them, and it was all, like, super easy. So that was, like, the big aha moment, and also, really showing the power of embracing structured content, but also just how this all should work from a content operations perspective as well.
Yeah, excellent. And because when it comes to migrations, I suppose it can be tempting just to lift and shift from a previous system, which in a lot of cases, that's not actually a good idea, because you're just recreating the problems of the past. But it sounds like they already had a good structure, which would make that a lot simpler to go.
Yeah. And I can totally see, in those really big migrations, and not even big migrations, any migration, like, you're really, you're under pressure, to get off a previous system. Maybe you're under contract. You want to, kind of make sure that you're getting your money's worth of the new system too. So there is a lot of that, like, we got to move fast. We can't really stop to, maybe pick some of these things apart and think about them, at, like, an academic level. So we really just got to, like, push. But in this case, this was a migration that took 18 months. So it was a big undertaking, and they had really, put in the work to make sure that this type of thing moving forward was going to be a lot easier and less stressful, for the whole team. There's hundreds of people working on this stuff.
And it comes down to that work in advance, isn't it? Like, to know that when you're going to press publish, it's going to work. Like, Sanity will do its part. All those other flow-on effects you need to make sure are fully tested. So, no, that sounds really cool. And because everything's programmatic and all code driven, it means that you can build workflows that you might, be able to automatically pull something from your existing source, transform it, import it. That's going to work. Sort of have that strategy in place.
And this is a very, this particular organization really has taken that customization to a whole new level. Like, it's probably the most bespoke setup I've seen, and really, like, when you see their studio, it's like, oh wow, like, this is Sanity.
It's almost unrecognizable. It's almost unrecognizable. The screenshots I've seen,
and they've just done such an amazing job, making the studio and all the content operations around the studio, like, feel like it reflects how they think about their business and, content operations. It's not just us and our platform, them having to, like, shoehorn it into how we think about things. Like, they've been able to really, do what they want to do and what they envisioned.
I think that's been some of the most interesting times I've had working with customers as well, is when they show you what they've done with Sanity that you'd never have thought of. Like, I remember having a conversation with one of our customers once who said they'd tried 40 different CMSs and none of them did internationalization the way we did, but the way they did was not a way that I've ever seen any of our customers do it. So when customers are able to come up with their own novel solutions because they're so in touch with what they need, that can be very interesting compared to a one-size-fits-all CMS for a blog that, everything fits the same, which Sanity just isn't. But then that meets the needs of those massive teams.
Absolutely.
Cool. So is there anything else you think we've missed off that perhaps developers are underappreciating or underestimating about the needs of authors?
I think there's this sort of new, I'm noticing this new trend, and it makes sense that it's bubbling up now. The big specter in the room is AI. Like, how does this kind of
comes up in every episode? We don't have to have to dance around.
But even for the content teams, like, what they're thinking about, which I think is important as a developer to remember and, consider as well, is, like, the investment. All these teams they're planning their content at scale. They want the ROI. They want to see a return on that investment of planning and executing, these kind of content strategies. So I think there's a way in which a single, kind of system like Sanity, this kind of content operating system, is really important, because there's also, like, the content people are trying to ask, okay, what's next and what can we draw on from what we already have? So, like, can we understand, like, if it's a, news organization who's really concerned with, okay, a news story broke, do we have existing content, that kind of ties into this, topic that everyone's talking about now? Can we pull from our backlog of articles about this person or about this topic and kind of bring that to the forefront? And so I think there's this kind of, it's not just about content, entry and management. It's really about, like, how do you use it as a strategic asset? And kind of, like, you have to be really quick, especially for examples that I'm thinking about is like, news and kind of journalism where it's like really fast moving stuff. You want to make sure you're serving relevant content to your audiences as you're producing new stuff. So I think like how do you mine for content that you already have, like in an easy way? Like someone doesn't have to just troll, all of your, all your, articles manually. Like, is that something for an agent to kind of assist with? And like, is there also a way in which, what you're managing in your system is more like the parameters of generating new content from things that you already have, like the seed of content that you already have in the system. So I think that's kind of bubbling up to me, and not just talking with current customers, but even prospects about what people are thinking about right now is like, how do we make this a lot more dynamic? And it's not always someone having to sit down, in a forum editor and like make content that way.
Yeah. It makes you think, like right back at the beginning of our conversation about like the real big picture light bulb customers are the ones that see that there's value in the content, that their content's not just a bunch of blog posts or marketing copy, but it's actually valuable business information. So being able to use AI to leverage that and get the value out of that is going to be the next level. Which have you used the MCP server yet?
I have, yeah.
I haven't.
I've been tinkering with it. I think it kind of speaks to that need. Like that is what editors are looking for, content people are looking for. Like I think there's probably a way in which the engineering, part of the equation can kind of make that more accessible to them too. Like, how do we enable people who aren't as familiar with these tools as well to kind of use them? But the underlying like technology and the way that it works and the things that you can do with it, like it's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, I've only sort of just looked at the screenshots of it, and I know I need the time to sit down and actually think about it. But yeah, the idea that I could talk to the data set essentially and then start making large sweeping intelligent sets of changes or new content or whatever, it's a whole new way of thinking of working with content.
Absolutely. Like it becomes this very like malleable or like plastic thing that you can kind of just like interact with in this like other dimension of, it's like a semantic dimension of content now. And you're just like, how do I tap into something that I already have and not have to ask an engineer to say, run this query to find this content and, generate this report for me and then spit it out. Like it becomes much more valuable in that way.
Yeah, I think the Agent Actions API is kind of similar in that way, where typically you run a webhook and it's like, well, I can run a function that says 1 + 1 = 2, where there now I can say, take this content and do something with it. And being able to semantically program new values is a whole new world.
Exactly.
All right, cool. Thanks for joining me today on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
All right.
That's great.